I will mention one more situation, which I've also described in the book Beyond the Brain, which is a little interesting paperback, and it's called A Sexual Profile of Men in Power. And basically it was a study done by 3 professionals on the East Coast, and it was a study of prostitutes, very high-class call girls, sort of in the category of Christine Keeler in the Perfume affair in England. So their clients were like very highly positioned men who were senators and governors, and there was one Supreme Court judge who was among the clients and so on. Now the study was very interesting because it was not the study of the prostitutes. They were not asking the question, why did these girls become prostitutes? It was the study of the clients. And the idea was, if there were not clients who have these kinds of demands and interests, these girls would be out of business. So let's look at the clients. Now what they found out is that these men in absolute minority came just for straight sex. They were coming from situations where it was not difficult to have sex. They were coming with very, very specific kind of deviant ways of satisfying their sexuality. And then frequently very specific ideas. It was kind of heavy, kinky sex in some instances. So they had a list of things that they were offering with prices on them. One was called golden shower, which was being peed on in the sexual situation. One was called the brown shower, which was being defecated on. They were willing to stage some very complex situations, which were fantasies that the clients came with and wanted to experience, like pretending that this was a situation where an American pilot was shot during the Second World War in Nazi Germany, and these girls were dressed as Gestapo women with helmets and with boots and so on, and they would do bondage and they would sort of whip the client, and then the release, the orgasm would happen in this kind of bondage situation. I know a similar situation which was not in the book, but it was something that a friend of mine told me. He had as a client a prostitute from the red light district there, and so he got a lot of stories from her, and they had one situation that was by far in the greatest demand, where the client could have 3 girls dressed like nuns in a closed room where he had the key, so he was controlling the situation. And he was chasing them, and they were pretending that they were frightened. So it was a kind of a fake rape. And while this was happening, they were playing sacred music through a sort of hi-fi system. So it's a very typical third matrix situation where there is the, sexuality, aggression, fear, but at the same time, it's peculiar kind of a mixture. So back to the sexual profile of men in power. Many of these clients, after whatever the scene was that they enacted, after the orgasm, they actually wanted to be held naked, and they wanted to suck on the breast. So these were psychoanalytically oriented researchers. So they interpreted these situations using psychoanalytic jargon. So for example, when it was the golden shower or the brown shower, it had something to do with toilet training and anal fixation. If it was whipping, it was need for parental punishment. If they wanted to be held on the breast and sucking, this was a regression to the oral level and so on. But when we take a closer look, what many and most of these situations were about were actually enactment of the birth situation, where the bondage and the torture, including the scatological aspect, the feces and the urine and so on, were really elements present in birth. And then after this was over, then the breast came. So it was not regression to the breast, but actually from their perspective, psychological progression, because they were under the influence of the perinatal matrix. There was a very interesting conclusion that they made when they basically said that they found that these were people in power. These were, highly ambitious men who were coming for these kinds of situations. So they concluded that men who have very strong ambition to the point that they are striving for political places and so on, they also have very strong libido that can take kind of deviant forms. So that the American public shouldn't expect that politicians would be like models of moral behavior, that if you want a politician, you get a package, sort of that you shouldn't be surprised when these things are happening. Now that raises a very interesting question that has something to do with the psychology of Freud versus the psychology of another renegade, which is Alfred Adler, who challenged Freud, and he put down the significance of sexuality, which was emphasized by Freud, and he himself emphasized something else, which was the inferiority complex, sense of inadequacy, and a tendency to overcompensate it as being actually the most powerful driving force in the psyche. Now, on a level of thinking, which is just postnatally biographical, this is a significant distinction, because for Freud, people want power because it gives them better sexual opportunities. For Adler, people want power, and they use sex to get power. And of course, in everyday life, we see both instances. Different people approach it differently. But if we bring in the model that includes the perinatal dimension, we see that we can sort of bring these two together, that in the third matrix, the child is exposed to a situation which is so overbearing, so demanding, that it's sort of way above his or her head. So there's this feeling of inadequacy and helplessness, but at the same time it's a life-threatening situation. So there's this desperate effort to overcome it anyway and to get sort of on top of it, so that both of those sides are present. And at the same time, this pain and the choking is create this tremendous sexual tension that wants discharge. So on the perinatal level, the Adlerian and the Freudian dimension are just two sides of the same coin. So we could continue like this. We could go to a number of other emotional disorders and psychosomatic disorders, but I think these are the main examples that are enough to show how our understanding of psychopathology, or what's called traditionally psychopathology, would change if we approach it in the context of this larger cartography. Now, I have talked a lot about birth and the birth trauma and the importance of the birth trauma, which could very easily leave you with the impression that I'm talking here somehow about causal influences, that somehow all these problems are caused by the birth trauma, which is a way that I saw it initially, because I was coming from traditional medical training, from a traditional psychiatric training, and from a Freudian training, where there is a tendency to reduce somehow psychology to biology. But I was also mentioning that these problems have then a very significant transpersonal dimension, and there's a vast domain in the psyche which is really beyond the perinatal, and in my present understanding, in a sense, supraordinated to the perinatal and the biographical. So the way I see it now is that we're basically dealing here with archetypal fields of energy that find their manifestation either on the transpersonal level or the perinatal level or the biographical level. So today I would see actually biological birth itself being a manifestation of a certain sequence of archetypal patterns rather than trying to explain, for example, archetypes from biological birth. There's a whole other dimension which would require a special seminar. I've done now a lot of work together with Rick Tarnas, who is an excellent astrologer, also a person who is very knowledgeable about non-ordinary states of consciousness. He wrote his dissertation in psychology on psychedelic therapy. And what we have found out is that there is tremendous correlation between experiences in non-ordinary states and astrological archetypes, particularly in relation to transits. For example, just very briefly, if we look at the 4 perinatal matrices, which is something that I formulated long before I had any notion of astrology, there is a striking similarity to 4 major astrological archetypes. Of course, the first matrix is the oceanic, the cosmic, which in astrological terms would be certainly related to Neptune. The second matrix is about oppression, compression, depression, starvation, guilt, and so on, which is very Saturnian. Quite amazing is the third matrix, which is powerful energies, birth, sex, death, rebirth, and also scatology, elimination, biological, excreta, and so on. All those in astrology would be linked to Pluto. And then the fourth matrix would be defined as sudden, unexpected resolution of a difficult situation, breakthrough, insights, epiphany, and so on. And in astrological terms, that would be Uranus. So this similarity itself is very interesting, but what is absolutely mind-blowing is that if we then study specifically people who have these experiences, you'll find out that they actually would have experiences of these matrices at the time when they have these planets that I mentioned as significant transits. So astrology can be used as a way of predicting what kind of experiences people will have in non-ordinary states.